Hello subscribers and others, it's David Hoffman, filmmaker, about to tell you a story that I really appreciate. It's a story about my relationship with the greatest narrator in America in the 20th century. His name was Peter Thomas. Peter Thomas was famous. He was the voice of Coca-Cola, IBM, NBC, Burger King, Cool Whip, and others. He was PBS's Nature series and Nova, and of course, he was Forensic Files.
In 1993, on an Indian reservation in the southwestern United States, young Navajo Indians were dying at an alarming rate.
Now, I want you to think for a minute of the job of the narrator. Why is Peter Thomas so good? Many of you have written me, oh, that's Peter Thomas, Forensic Files, in my movies. Why is he so good? Well, because he sounds like an ordinary citizen, rather than a voice like this. And he speaks in a way where every word makes sense. That's because they do make sense to him. He's a great interpreter of words. And when I worked with him, I wrote the music, and he was the instrument that played it.
I could talk about David Hoffman now until tomorrow and not cover everything. We started working together about 20 years ago, and I remember the one thing that struck me most about David was his intense involvement in anything that he did. Now, we had 20 commercials to do for United Technologies, and we had the entire day to do it, and Dave comes out. We didn't work against film, but all he did was he sat right next to me and he started talking about how he made this film, what it meant to him, the background. And before I knew it, I was taking everything that he was giving it and putting it in my brain, and it came out of my voice.
He would say, David, read me that. And I would say, okay, Peter. He was the voice of Coca-Cola, of IBM, of NBC, Burger King, and Cool Whip. Peter would go, he was the voice of, just like me, he was the voice of Coca-Cola, IBM, Burger King, and Cool Whip. But he did it better than me. It sounded better than me every time. So we would play this music back and forth between Peter Thomas and David Hoffman, and Peter Thomas and David Hoffman. And he made what he thought of as his greatest film with me. It's called Reflections, and I have a piece of it on my YouTube channel, but just a little sense of Peter Thomas, Reflections. Just take a listen.
After 4 days of this, when you've done more tests than you can count, you and your partner, Dave Scott, get set to leave the land that's been your home and go outside. So you put on your suit, you get all ready, and then you go out the door. The first thing you see is the sun rising over the Pacific, and it's an incredible sight. But you can't look at it for too long because you really don't have time. You've only got 40 minutes outside to do everything you have to do, so you start taking lots of photographs, like you're supposed to.
Peter did so many films for me. He did this World War I film where I said the trenches were the horror of World War I. Disgusting, Peter. I have this little piece of script on the trenches made for high school seniors. Let's read it that way. And out came Peter Thomas reading this.
Amid the horror of battle, one looks for a tiny fragment of beauty, or glory, or meaning. But one looks in vain for any of this in the trenches of the Western Front. Soldiers had marched into battle for thousands of years and hurled themselves at one another. But never before with the machine gun, the tank, poison gas, and heavy artillery hitting back at them.
Part of the reason Peter read that with such emotion is because he had been in war. He was a World War II veteran. He had a Purple Heart. He was one of those first soldiers into the concentration camps, which he told me he never forgot, the shock of it all. And when he came back, he was not only a patriot, but he really cared about people knowing what the war experience is like. So every time I had something on war, Peter was great. One thing about Peter, though, he never appeared on screen. But one time I talked him into doing an on-screen narration. You're about to see that. This is what Peter looked like. I don't say it's the best commercial I ever made, but it's Peter Thomas on screen speaking directly to you.
Some words about technology. When you say the word technology to most people, they usually think of some complex, dehumanized machine. But that's wrong. Technology is anything people use that makes their lives easier. Now, most people feel comfortable with the technology of their grandfathers, like this plane.
Would Peter read a script with any issue? I can't remember a script he didn't read. I mean, he read right-wing stuff, left-wing stuff, anti-smoking stuff. I don't know if he ever did cigarettes, I'm not sure. But certainly pro-alcohol, anti-alcohol. That wasn't his issue. His issue was to try to express it in a way that identified with people and spoke to people. And maybe that's saying something about what I'm about to say about Peter Thomas, his magnificent kindness, gentleness, and appreciation of other people. He was beautiful to work with. I so miss him. He died at 91, I believe. I was recording narrations with him when he was 89 in his house in Florida. Just kind, appreciative of art. He saw the artist as valuable, and he saw his reading of the script as helping the artist feel more able. And that's what he did for me. So I meant to make this, Peter, when you were alive. We talked about it lots, but I never did. But here it is now. I honor you, Peter Thomas. I love you, Peter Thomas. I appreciate you, Peter Thomas. And wherever you are, I want you to know David Hoffman will never forget you. I'd like to end with just a piece of this clip from my Sputnik Mania documentary on 1957. You probably have seen it if you're a subscriber because it's been seen by so many people and it's so controversial. It doesn't show everything about the 1950s. It doesn't show black people. It doesn't show poor people. It doesn't show rural people. It just shows a piece of the culture that I was using to create this, what I call the Sputnik moment. And that's another story. But here's Peter. Just listen to the flow of his words and the way that he reads this.
The time was 1957. Rock and roll was new, and Elvis was the king. Gasoline was cheap, 25 cents a gallon, and it was pumped for you by uniformed attendants.
But of course, service without having to ask for it.
He understands the rules, and he follows them.
It's tempting to chuckle and look at these people from the 1950s as uptight.
The students like it. The parents like it, and best of all, it works.
All of this was possible because of our industrial and economic power, and because of what was commonly called better living through science.
Inventors, engineers, and manufacturers continually offer us improvements so we can have
ever greater progress in science and business that ensure a way of life that is physically gratifying and spiritually uplifting.
Chemists have a lot to do with this, turning coal into everything from truck tires to sheer 90s.
The world of science has given us some fabulous things.
Materials which make fabrics more beautiful and easier to care for than natural ones.
New and better stretch yarn for women's stockings.
In the world of tomorrow, plastics will certainly call the tune.
The scientist has something to offer to the public which is far, far more than gadgets and inventions.
We had faith in our science and our scientists. In the 1950s, American scientists had given us the discovery of DNA
thread of life.
And the Salk polio vaccine.
The vaccine to prevent paralytic polio, developed by Dr. Jonas Salk.
And American engineers won high praise worldwide for our new American highway system, with millions of miles of paved roads.
More motorized mobility than ever dreamed of before.
Freedom of movement for all, symbol of democracy.
We have become the nation on wheels.
And this is Levittown.
Levittown, one of the world's largest single-unit housing developments.
To make the American dream a reality for everyone, developers were building tens of millions of houses.
The budget-priced home. This symbol of modern American living has changed the great USA.
You can raise your children far from the city's dirt, crowding, and crime. In
middle class.
Never in history has the American family known such well-being.
A standard of living beyond the wildest dreams of anyone who lived a half-century ago.
Today, the middle-class American dream is sometimes made fun of. But for adults at that time, it wasn't funny. It was literally a dream come true. But there was a dark cloud hanging over that dream, over every home, over every suburb, and every city.